presented by Homestead Community Land Trust. I'm Kathleen Hosfeld, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to our event today. I'm joined by three colleagues, Tony Toe, ED of Homesight, Gardheere, Puget Sound, and Wyking, Garrett of Africatown, and we're so grateful to have you with us. Thank you. We are also very grateful to Coyote Central for letting us use their fabulous space, and grateful also to Bellwether for letting us use their PA system. I am moderating this panel because I've had the pleasure and privilege of working with Homestead since the fall of 2014 as their executive director, and I'm passionate about Homestead's partnership with our homeowners and with the community to take on one of essentially the toughest challenges you can take on, which is creating a community that everyone can afford, where everyone can afford to live. I'm going to say a few words about Community Land Trust in general, and then tell you a little bit about Homestead's history specifically, and then talk a little bit about homeownership and the wealth gap. And then I'm going to turn it over to our panelists. So Community Land Trust will probably not appear on the platforms of any of our 2016 presidential candidates, but if he had wanted to, candidate Bernie Sanders could have taken a little credit for inspiring some of Homestead's work. As mayor of Burlington, Vermont in the 1980s, he supported the formation of the Burlington Land Trust, which ultimately became Champlain Housing Trust, the largest community land trust in the country with almost over 600 owner-occupied homes, as well as 2,000 apartments and co-op units. That represents about 7% of the housing stock in Burlington, Vermont. Imagine if Seattle had 7% of its homes in community land trust, permanently affordable. As Burlington discovered, community land trusts are strategic resources that communities can use to create and preserve affordable housing, and to develop and steward homes, commercial space, and other assets for the public good. The modern Community Land Trust was launched out of the Civil Rights Movement by friends of the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. And in 1969, New Communities was founded in Albany, Georgia, for the purpose of helping African American farmers gain access to land for farming. And at one time, that Community Land Trust had 5,700 acres of land. Today, the Community Land Trust is often used when, like in Seattle, runaway real estate prices put housing, and in Homestead's case, home ownership, out of the reach of working people. Homeowners in our program buy their home and lease their land from Homestead for a small monthly fee. This reduces the cost of ownership by about a third. So working with public and private funders, we're able to offer people who make less than 80% of area median income the opportunity to own their own home with just several $1,000s down in down payment. And in exchange for this opportunity, our buyers pay it forward, if you will, by agreeing to a formula resale price that keeps the price of the home affordable to the next limited income buyer. So buyers can keep their homes for as long as they want, but when they resell, they make the same dream of home ownership possible for the next buyer. Once a home is it becomes part of the Community Land Trust, it is permanently affordable. And I like to put it this way, that affordability lives at that address forever, even though different families will own and live there over time. So Homestead Community Land Trust was incorporated in 1992 by residents of the Central District in South Seattle, and placed its first home in the trust about 10 years later. One of the reasons Homestead formed was to try to prevent the displacement of African American families in the Central District. But by the time Homestead got its first home and caught its first win, essentially, much had already been lost here in the Central District. In 1990, there were nearly 3 times as many black families as white residents in the Central District, but by 2000, the number of white residents surpassed the number of blacks for the first time in 30 years. So there are people here today, and I'm making eye contact with some of you, who could meaningfully debate on the complex and interrelated dynamics of gentrification and displacement. I am not one of them. But what I can say is that community land trust homes are part of the solution to prevent further displacement and to preserve affordability in neighborhoods like this one as they change and revitalize. And Homestead is committed to serving the city of Seattle and partnering with organizations and groups like Puget Sound Sage and Homesight and Africatown to do just that. So why is that important? The affordability crisis that afflicts Seattle and frankly the entire United States in varying degrees affects everyone. But for more than 100 years, restrictive residential covenants, discriminatory federal policies, bank redlining, and predatory lending practices have disproportionately affected racial and ethnic minorities, creating increased obstacles to their homeownership. Study after study has shown that homeownership is one of the best ways to create intergenerational wealth. So what happens when people have easier access to homeownership than others is what we have right now. In addition to a growing wealth gap that we're all aware of, there is an even wider racial wealth gap, with median income white families having 13 times the wealth of median income black families. Homestead's work of creating permanently affordable homes for ownership seeks to address this inequity. We wanted to convene this conversation today to hear from these panelists and from you about the role of homeownership in an inclusive and equitable community. We believe there's still time to make homes in Seattle permanently affordable for generations to come. The staff and board of Homestead, along with these community partners, are committed to doing just that. So a little commercial. If you would like to support our work, please consider joining us for our upcoming stewardship breakfast on May 26th at Seattle Sheraton. Our title is Homeownership Changes Everything. There's information on the table by the door, not about the breakfast, because I forgot that. But there is a sign-up sheet that you can give us your name and your email contact, and we'll follow up to make sure you get an invitation. Or you can just follow us on Facebook and Twitter. And if you want to share about your experience of this conversation tonight on Facebook or Twitter or Instagram, we encourage you to use the hashtag HomesteadCLT. Welcome. So with that, I would like to introduce our panelists. Gardheere is Program Director at Puget Sound Sage. She is responsible for advancing Sage's priorities related to equitable transit-oriented development, and she focuses on land use policy, affordable housing policy, transit-oriented development, community-based participatory planning, leadership development, and the importance of racial justice in policymaking. She has worked extensively with East African refugee immigrant community in Washington State for over 10 years as an organizer, lobbyist, human rights advocate, and resource development director. Uba is Somali American and is trilingual, English, Somali, and Swahili. She's the co-founder of the Culturally Appropriate and Responsive Education Center, an organization with a mission to eliminate the opportunity gap among low-income East African youth in South King County. Uba also serves on the boards of African Diaspora of Washington and the Social Justice Fund Northwest, a foundation working on the front lines of social change. Tony Toe is the Executive Director of Homesight, where he has served since 2004. He is a leader and catalyst of numerous initiatives to address equity and justice issues in Southeast Seattle. He has served on the Board of Directors of the Washington Low-Income Housing Alliance and the Washington State Affordable Housing Advisory Board, the Growing Transit Communities Committee, and the Seattle Planning Commission. He is co-chair of the Regional Equity Network, which created through Puget Sound's HUD Sustainable Communities Regional Planning Grant, completed in 2013. It is a network of 30 or so community-based and advocacy organizations and jurisdiction partners. Welcome, Tony. And Wyking Garrett is a social entrepreneur, the founding director of Umoja Peace Center, chief strategist for Africatown, Seattle Community Development Initiative, and co-organizer of Hack the CD. Africatown highlights the rich and unique gifts that Seattle residents from the African diaspora contribute to our city's character and vibrancy. And the Umoja Peace Center is a youth-focused, community-based cultural center in the heart of Seattle's historic Central District. The mission of the center is to inspire and empower youth through positive education, art, culture, and enterprise, PEACE. A recognized change agent, Wyking was the recipient of the 2014 Center for Ethical Leadership Legacy Leadership Award and is an inaugural member of the Seattle Music Commission. Welcome to all of you. Each of our panelists is going to take about 10 minutes to make remarks from their area of expertise in the housing industry, and then I'm going to pose several questions for discussion with them, and then we'll open it up for questions from the floor. And we've passed out some index cards. If you could write your questions as we go along, and we'll collect those and answer as many of them as we can after the presentations and the discussion. So, I think I'll turn it over to our panelists. Who wants to go first? Wyking, you want to go first?
Sure, it's better to go first than follow these two. Open to that. I wouldn't say I'm an expert in the housing field, except that I have to live in a house every day. Face the challenges that come with that. I would like to share more insights and perspective on what Africatown is. By show of hands, how many people have heard of Africatown? We're doing pretty good. We're doing pretty good these days. Okay, so Africatown is a asset-based community development and creative placemaking initiative, which is really about redefining what Black communities are in the 21st century. If we look at this particular community, I'm third generation in the Central District. My grandfather came here, like many other African Americans who migrated from the South, seeking better economic opportunities and fleeing, kind of the terrorism of Southern, life. The Central District has been a place of settling for Black people, people of African descent for over 130 years. William Gross bought 12 acres of land from Henry Yesler in 1882, and that basically established his community as a place as he made his land available and partitioned it off to other families that were coming into the community. The actual very first resident of recognized Black resident of Seattle was Manuel Lopez, who was from Cape Verde off the coast of West Africa. And so, from the first person, I guess you could say, this has been a diasporic community as it relates to Black people. And so there was the first waves, and there's books like the Seattle Black Victorians, which talk about the first waves of African Americans that came here and kind of lived in Seattle. And World War II was the time when the larger population migration for Boeing jobs and can everybody hear me?
Yeah.
Do we need the microphone? Are we okay right here? Great. All right. So so as described before, racial covenants and the policies and practices of the public sector and private sector basically quarantine the Central District as a place where African Americans and others were forced to live. And so even under those conditions, a vibrant community grew, people took roots, and established community in the real sense, not in the sense of just, a place where you, I guess, stay rather than a place where you live and you grow. And I believe my generation may have been the last generation to really grow up like that in the Central District, and I think that's a larger societal, issue related to economics and all those things. And so, we have from the Central District, African Americans made many contributions to the character, the soul, the fabric of Seattle. When you think about, I'm a member of the Music Commission, and so when we talk about Seattle being a city of music, the Jackson Street Jazz legacy, Ray Charles, Quincy Jones, Ernestine Anderson, who just made her transition recently, and Jimi Hendrix, who used to come, and I hear the stories of him coming and playing in the basement of my grandparents' house with my older uncles, and so this is, even to now, where you have, two prominent artists, the largest being, Malcolm Moore bringing, Grammys back to Seattle, which is really rooted in this, the Black music tradition that comes from the Central District, and then the other, prominent soul artist from the Central District, right? I mean, not from the Central District, but from Seattle right now is Alan Stone. So, which is, kind of problematic in many ways. But then you look at the progressive values around social justice and human rights and things which Seattle, I think, prides itself on aspiring to, and we have to credit, the human rights struggles of the Black community. People like, Martin Luther King came to Seattle. He goes to Garfield High School. He goes to Mount Zion. Stokely Carmichael. And the Black Panther being the second chapter of the Black Panther Party outside of California, being started right here in this community. And so, this obviously these struggles, inspired and informed other groups to also pursue, their full, human rights and civil rights and equality. We look at 1968 being a kind of a culmination, and that year marked many things in our society, but right here in this community, it marked the opening of a Liberty Bank, which was the first Black bank established west of the Mississippi, which my grandfather was one of the co-founders of. And in a capitalist society, the ability to concentrate, access, and distribute capital is a critical function, obviously. And so the establishment of that institution as a necessity because of redlining, as was mentioned, prohibiting access and restricting access to the community was very important. Unfortunately, after that time of 1968, I would say 1969, just nationally, I mean, this is the time when you have basically the U.S. government declaring war against the Black freedom struggle, and assassinations and all of these things that were happening at that time, coupled with the policies of divestment and benign neglect and a community. So the trajectory didn't continue to be really in a positive way. And so, this community, like many other communities, is marked as an undesirable community, a blight, something to not be invested in, something to avoid, that dark place, right? And this continued and is, I guess, most signified in the institution of a policy called weed and seed, right? I mean, just those words are very vivid, and many people don't know that Seattle was the pilot city for weed and seed, which was then shipped out across the nation. And so you have to say, when we look today, based on the statistics that you gave, who were identified as weeds and who was identified as seeds. And so, this permeates all of the policies from banking to education to policing we think about how do you create a community, create places to gather, things of that nature. That was the exact opposite of what happened. Bus stops were removed. I mean, everything was the kind of the exact opposite of building or strengthening community as it relates to the Black community. So, and we look at, kind of a different path that happened, in the, in our neighbor community, our brothers and sisters in Chinatown International District, again, to continue to, maintain a sense of community and grow and have a, cultural and economic core, and be even recognized. We come to Chinatown, we see the gates, this is an aspect of honoring or saying you're a valuable part of our community, and even more recently, street signs and things of that nature. And so when we look at Africatown, part of Africatown was just looking at kind of the model and understanding that, of all of the groups that have come to America, or what was called the New World, Black people are probably the only group that were not able to maintain a sense of connection with their mother country. I mean, the fact that we have New England and New Hampshire and New Orleans and all these is to say, and that I'm speaking English, right? It says that people maintain a sense of connection with their mother country, and that's happened across the broad, and there's value in that. There's cultural capital, there's social capital, that's important. So Africatown is really a matter of redefining our community as a positive place and uplifting the many contributions that people of African descent have made, not only to Seattle, to American, to the world, and really lifting that up and providing, kind of a menu or a database of inspiration. So when we think about, we had a whole campaign over the last year, Imagine Africatown, and we asked people of all communities and all over, what would you want to see in this community that honored something of significance that you think is positive, contributed by, people of African descent. So some people, reference, well, I would like to see the Jackson Street Jazz legacy honored in some type of venue or eatery, or some people speak about Black Wall Street that was in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and having a vibrant commercial district. Others spoke about the Harlem Renaissance. People speak about, Afro-Latin culture, Caribbean. So there was just this wide, variety. People reference Timbuktu as an educational center. And so how do we bring these things forward, obviously in a modern sense, but inspired by. And so that is, kind of the overview of what, Africatown represents. It represents maintaining and developing a space in Seattle, here in the Central District, since, this is where the community has been centered, that is a place where you could say Black lives actually truly matter, right? A place where people of Africa, the best, the brilliance, the beauty of people of African descent can exist and grow and add value to Seattle and the world. And so that is the overview of what Africatown is about. And when we, share the vision, obviously a lot of people first think, well, does that mean, is it exclusive? It's like, well, do you like coffee? One of the biggest companies that are based in Seattle is built off of part of African culture, the Ethiopian coffee ceremony. And so we could go on and on about what those things are. So really it's kind of reframing, how we appreciate and value each other, right? And if a part of our community is vulnerable to being displaced or how do we show up and say we value your presence and we want to make sure we create an environment where you can exist and grow. And so there's many initiatives tied to that. I mean, Africatown is a comprehensive development. Obviously, home ownership or affordable access to housing, whether it's renting and owning, business, affordable space for business, arts, institutions, is critical, because otherwise, Central District was just designated as the second arts district in Seattle, with a focus on African-American, Afro-diaspora culture. I just came actually from that steering committee meeting here, but we don't want the community to just become a museum of, here's a plaque, this was here, but we think the greatest honor is to have people continuing the legacy in the space. And I think home ownership of land is something that does create a sense of permanency, stability, and that is one's primary source of wealth accumulation, or has been, and definitely in the African American community. And we see that the last predatory mortgage crisis wiped out over $1 trillion. It was the largest transfer of wealth, and I think ever. And so we really have to focus on how do we make land affordable. And so we've been initiating a series of events themed hacking gentrification. And so our premise there is where Seattle tech is displacing a lot of people, and our community has not participated in the growth of these various sectors. But we have some of the smartest people in the world in Seattle, and we think that if we can have 3 companies that think it's possible to colonize outer space, Mars and the moon, that we can figure out, if we actually have the will, we can figure out some innovative tools that not only work here, but can be shared throughout the country. And so that is our challenge. I mean, it's one of the most educated cities, most well-resourced, wealthy cities. So you have the know-how, we have the means. The next thing is, is just really getting everyone to understand that, Black people historically have been like the canary in the mine, and so you may not think about it affecting you, but I think now everyone is understanding, since, kind of the Occupy and all that, people understand that this is an issue that affects everyone. It's something that we've been struggling with for many years, but now there's more, the pain is being shared, and so now there's a little more, I think, incentive to bring about solutions. And if we can address the problem here, same things are happening on Capitol Hill, International District, South Seattle. It's just a matter of time, and so we can all come together and understand that this is a problem that impacts all of us. And when we're at our best, everyone benefits, I think. So that's what I have to say.
Here, here. Tony?
So I wanted to talk about equity. That's actually, I'm doing more stuff around equity than about housing right now, actually. And there's equity and equity, but they are actually the same thing. One is equity is wealth, which Wyking talked about, and also equity is about where we start in the ladder to opportunity. And the two things are related, in this country, because we do live in a capitalist society. And so property ownership, having control of assets, matters a lot. It matters what your position is in society. And the history of this country in denying equity, a central part of that was race and xenophobia, but primarily race. Xenophobia came later. And I think why it's important to understand that is because if you understand that when you start from a place of inequity, where you have a big gap between the haves, and not only the have-nots, but those that were not allowed to have. Okay? It's different. This is where the idea of privilege comes from. You can have equal treatment, which we have today. The Constitution allows for that. But the Constitution was written at a time when there was slavery. So we're starting in an unequal place, and you can have equal treatment, and it just goes like this. And today's society, where you have finance capital, and where you have, instantaneous flipping and margin profits, it's actually, when you have equal treatment, it's like this. So just because people are being treated fairly and everybody has the same opportunity to do something, doesn't mean that we're all gonna have that. We actually have that. And so equity means that we have to actually overcompensate. We have to affirmatively do more for those that are at the bottom than for those that are in the middle or at the top. And one of the areas where this is probably the most challenging is in the area of ownership. And it's home ownership for individuals and for households. It's community ownership. When you look at communities, people that rent or that are tenants, you can't stay. And even the zoning in the city, where the majority of the zoning is single family, and it's the most exclusive single family code in the United States of America, it's a settlers system. Those who are here already and got it, get to keep it. Newcomers, people that look different, don't have access to it. So our zoning, which many of our neighborhoods and our individuals pride ourselves in, the character of the neighborhoods in Seattle, it's actually one of those inequitable and racist things in the city, especially when there were actual covenants that disallowed people of color to buy land only in certain places in the city. So, so that's why home ownership is more than just this abstract idea that you own and you have wealth. Ownership of assets was a way to deny opportunity and to enslave people. Literally in the case of black people, and metaphorically in the case of people that came later. And so that's really the main point that I want to make. I think that this inequity was further perpetrated by stuff that Wyking was talking about, and covenants. Banks wouldn't lend. Homesight started in the Central District. And one of the reasons why Homesight was created was because banks would not lend in the Central District. Appraisers were afraid to come to the Central District. We couldn't get appraisers to come here to appraise properties because they were afraid. Were they really afraid, or was it implicit bias or explicit bias? There was just a lot of things with real estate agents, with banks, with credit, with everything that denied the ability of this community, and even those who owned, because there were a lot of African American homeowners, black homeowners, to really be able to have appreciation, to be able to grow their assets. The other thing I want to say about home ownership is that in the absence of rent control, it is one of the, now, over 70% of the white people in this country own their own homes. We forget that. The majority of the housing for white people in this country is owned housing. It's not rental housing. In Seattle, you kind of lose that because, everything is so expensive. And I think the home ownership rate is only 50%. And among communities of color, it's probably like below 20%. Particularly African Americans, probably under 10%. So anyway, it's also stability, and the flip side of equity and wealth is displacement. And I think that's a huge challenge right now in the city. Back in the 70 years ago, 70% of the Central District was African American. When we started working here in the 70s, in the 90s, 50% of the population was African American, and today it's less than, I think, probably 15%. So this is another reason why, when you own something, I can never lose that image of that ugly-looking house that they show with this development around it, and the lady died, and there was a big thing. Well, it was an ugly house, but you know what? To me, she owned it. She held the deed to that, and if she didn't want to move, they couldn't move her. You can't say that about tenants and renters, whether it's homeowners or community ownership of community centers, cultural institutions, churches, or whatever. So So that's the second thing that I wanted to say. And then the last thing is that when you are legally and socially, structurally and systemically denied the ability to own something or to have something, then when you aspire, you're aspiring for something that you will never get. So for those of us who are not privileged, when you have unfulfilled aspirations, to me it's just as important as needs that are unmet. This town, we talk a lot about needs. And a lot of stuff is class-based, and there's no question there's class oppression, class exploitation, class discrimination, but we focus a lot on real things that people don't have, like the homeless. Obviously, they don't have a place to live, you know, but we never think about aspirations. And I want to raise the point that, but when you are an oppressed community or an oppressed person, and I don't mean, I mean systemically oppressed, your aspirations unmet are just as bad as real needs for others that are not met. And this is something that I think that, because there's so much hope, there's so much effort to try to achieve things, and people don't achieve them because of racism and because of denial, that fighting for those things is just as important. Fighting for that hope and supporting that hope is just as important as meeting real needs for others. And I'm not saying it's not important to meet real needs, but it's just as important.
Thanks, Kathleen, Wyking, and Tony, and Homestead for having us here. And just realized, like, I was listening to all of you guys, and you have hit some of the points that I was going to talk about, but I'm just going to talk about it anyways, because I get it, and it just reinforces. But before I do that, I just want to talk a little bit about Puget Sage and why whatever housing expertise means. You know, everybody has, you know, a different definition of what experts is. What has given me that expertise? So Puget Sage, our mission is to grow communities where our families thrive. And we do this by using combination of research, policy, leadership development, civic engagement, and just kind of figure out how we can create equitable and sustainable communities in most of the pressing issues that are happening in our region, like affordable housing, climate justice, you know, living with jobs, and transit justice. And we try not to like talk about those in silos, you know, because a lot of times they're interrelated. And I came into Sage working for a coalition called South Communities Organizing for Racial and Regional Equity. It's a coalition of about 19 organizations rooted in Southeast Seattle with a mission to be an organized voice for community-controlled and inspired development. And it just started about 3 years ago when the light rail, you know, started, and the folks who are like living in Southeast Seattle in Central District were not actually reaping the benefits of, you know, that investment. We create a space and a table to make sure that the community is most impacted at the decision-making tables, you know, and actually doing that, I was able to be positioned to be in the HALA or HA, the Housing Affordability and Livability Agenda, that people have been talking about the last few months, you know. But for me, some of the policies I'm going to talk about, I like talking about that because to frame it from historical perspective that you talked about, because I found that it provides a frame of reference to effectively deal with this institutional racism and classism, and it's not that we woke up one day and our region is the way it is. There was actually intentional and unintentional policies that were put in place that made that happen, right? Like Wyking and Tony were talking about. I've realized that I'm from Africa. ownership is here in this country. We always talk about the American opportunity, and when we came here, everybody's like, where's the opportunity? I've been here for 20 years and I'm still kind of in that rat race trying to find that opportunity. But one of the ways to build wealth is through home ownership, right? And talking about, when you're talking about the racially restrictive covenants and things like that, when I first heard about that, I was like blown away. I was like, what? This is the America that I came to, full of opportunity. It cannot happen. And it was like about 3 years ago, and I have actually the language that was written in the deeds, and I want to read this part to you guys. This was from Ballard, the same folks that came out of the woodworks when Hala came up with the recommendation of upzoning their single family homes, you know, and that was like actually in the urban villages, right? It was like about probably 6% of that were going to be absorbed. And just putting that into perspective, 60% of zoning in Seattle is for single family homes. This is the history that they have, and the privilege that they had to be able to come to that, and then, you know, oh, this is going to be in the news, so I don't want to, in the radio, but, and then just, you know, they just came over the woodworks and the mayor changed his stance, right? That's what organizing is called, the privilege. But this is what he says: no part of said property hereby conveyed shall ever be used or occupied by any person of the Ethiopian, Malay, or any Asiatic race, and the guarantee his heirs, personal representative, or assigns shall never place any such person in the possession or occupancy of said property. That was in Ballard, and there's like a lot of the same kind of languages, and I still am. I was like, I heard about racism, I heard about institutional racism, but to this extent, I was really surprised. And this racially restrictive covenants and redlining and actually putting freeways in the middle of, you know, in homes of where African Americans lived, all that is the policies that I'm talking about. And this was an extreme result of segregation. That's why Seattle is the way it is. That's why Tony talks about 70% of Central District were blacks and African Americans. And then when and Wyking's talking about, you know, how, I'm gonna look that up and find more information about the wheat and seed, but lack of investments and economic development. And by 1950s, they found out that Seattle had spread out up to its current borders, and many familiar suburbs were already in place. And then I think that a lot of the policies that we need in order to undo this, we have to be radical. We have to use the same amount of investments in that these communities were given when the suburbs were being built, right? To be able to undo all this systemic racism and the lack of investments. And what would that look like? Well, I think Homestead, the land trust, is one way that we can do that. We need to start acquiring land, and we need to start doing that through co-ops. One of the things that I want to talk about around being on HADA, for example, is, okay, we are charged to come up with 50,000 housing, 20,000 of that, which is affordable housing, 80% AMI or below. They haven't even talked about the other AMIs and things like that. But a lot of that time we spent talking about rental. We didn't talk about home ownership. We didn't talk about building wealth and home ownership. So there was a little bit of that, and that was probably going to produce less than 2,000. And it was giving a little bit investment from the housing levy to, organizations like Homestead and things like that. But I'm we talk about we talk about the grand bargain and mandatory inclusion in housing. The name keeps changing, but I'm going to stick with the one that I'm used to. But why is that not some of the I was reading the resolution, and there's no even opportunity for home ownership in why don't we have some of that towards home ownership so that we can create permanent stability, so that we can create wealth. We are always focusing on, there's a lot of homeless folks in Seattle, and we have all this funding which is like more reactive. We're not being proactive. We're not creating long, stable home ownership. We're not, sorry, I just lost my train of thought, but we need to figure out a way to invest in these communities, in libraries coming in. Graham Street Station, for example, is Southeast Seattle right now. Today, actually, we found out that it's going to be in Sound Transit 3 project, but it's not going to be built until 2036. What can we do from now to 2036 to start acquiring land and put it in communities' hands, right? And what can we do? I mean, what can the city do to start giving us those investments and things like that, and start doing land banking and having community actually be in that decision-making table, and how do they want Graham Street Station TOD to look like, do they want childcare? Because a lot of times also it's just not about home ownership, but it's about cultural anchors, right? A lot of the Ethiopian community, all those cultural anchors, their folks have already been displaced. Folks come from all the way from Federal Way, Kent, to just come and break bread with their communities. What else do I have that I did not cover? The other thing that actually the three of us are also at this table, where the comprehensive plan is in the last year of being finalized, and there's these maps, these beautiful maps that they made that is accompanying the comprehensive plan, but it's telling the story that we've been telling for the last few years, where displacement is happening, it's coming to neighborhood near you. What do we need to do in order to mitigate the displacement? And one of the things that we are talking about is having actually concrete projects, like Rainier Beach has the Food Innovation District that has jobs attached to it, so that people can stay in place and take advantage of Rainier Beach light rail station. There is the Opportunity Center in Southeast Seattle, which maybe Tony can talk a little bit more about this, but has been already has an investment for over $3 million and bring jobs there. That's all I have. And also actually be more creative in, a lot of times, sometimes the rules and laws that are in place talking about the equity issue is, I come from a community where actually even if we had the money, we can buy homes because we need a Sharia compliance way to do it. So why don't we be creative and figure out ways where we can also work with this community and make sure that they get a piece of that. Thank you.
Thank you. I've got 4 questions to pose to our panel, and then we'll open it up to questions from all of you. The first one is, and Tony started to talk about this, but I'd love to hear more and hear from each of you. How do you define the terms equality and equity in the context of affordable homeownership?
Well, I saw a definition that said equality means sameness and equity means fairness. And so I think it was said before, if you start the race at the 50-yard line and I start and we both get a chance to run, I guess we have equality because we can both run, but it's not equity because for me to catch you, I'm probably going to have to run twice as fast to have just the same. So equity and taking it back to the sense of ownership and capital, Africans that were brought here have a labor equity investment in the American enterprise that has not been realized. And so at every chance, when there's an opportunity in the marketplace, we're gonna be at a disadvantage, right? Because especially if the foundation of, capitalist society is private ownership of capital, that you can then, each generation doesn't start over and work hard and pull themselves up by their bootstraps, it's more, like Donald Trump, he started from the bottom with $1 million. Started from the bottom down here, right? So when you're making the boots and someone else is taking the boots and then selling the boots and you're not getting any, you can't wear the boots. I mean, you have to make amends for that. You have to have, to even get to a place where we can have equality or say, it's equal opportunity, we have to balance the playing field. And when we're talking about this society, which is, in the economic system that we're in, there has to be a compensation, or reparation for, damages done, or my investment in the, half of my money helped build Microsoft, You need to have access to your capital. So we've been, black people generationally have been systematically denied access, not just to the marketplace, but to the very capital that they produced. And so, we have the Native American, we're in Duwamish land, that land capital plus the African labor capital produces the wealthiest nation on earth. But there's not just debt to China, there's other debts that need to be resolved in order to have really a just and fair, society. So those are some of my thoughts, that we have to be intentional and acknowledge the differences and why the differences exist. Because if they've been socially engineered into place, then they're gonna have to be, socially engineered out of place.
I don't know, when you ask that question, what comes to mind is, I don't know, how many of you have seen that picture of the stairs of equity and equality? And the equality is where you have a small boy, a middle height boy, and like a man, and then the stools are stairs, right? And the first one actually is all equal, and then they're looking at a fence watching the game. And when they all stand in that, the man, which is the privilege, gets to watch the game. The other two hardly see that, right? And the way they define the equity is, and then they have a stairs of those stools, and they all get to see it. For home ownership, I think it's equitable home ownership and all having access to capital. And I mean, when the home ownership investment was coming in, I don't know, it was 210 billion, right? And who benefited? 98% of the folks that benefited was white folks. So the reparation that you're talking about, why don't we have something similar to that, again, radical, and then make it equitable and have, like you said, you use that statistics where 70% of white folks already have own their homes, and they're not dealing with lack of capital and things like that. Why don't we do something like that where those, like you said, African American, they're disproportionately affected as far as home ownership is concerned. Why don't we invest and make sure that they get access to that capital and start building wealth that way, right? That's one of the ways, if I think about equitable home ownership.
Sometimes I think, like, people that have PhD degrees say, oh, you don't need a college education. Or people that have money that say, oh, money is everything in life. And I think there's a reason for that in Seattle, is because Seattle is very white. A lot of people own their homes. There's just not, if you go to many communities of color, cities, home ownership is their top housing priority. But for some reason in Seattle, it's a sin, frankly, for poor people to own. Because guess what? All of the city's programs is how to not let those people get a windfall. Okay? That's what the whole home ownership program in Seattle is based on. It's never that, guess what? They were denied even, you know, a windfall is actually reparation, from my perspective, from some of these communities. Okay, so that whole perspective is comes from a place of privilege. I think home ownership in and of itself is equity. And what we need to do is figure out different ways to create that opportunity with land trusts, with revolving loan fund, and increasingly because of just the cost of entry. I'm becoming a bigger and bigger supporter of the land trust model. I actually won the Shark Tank contest yesterday. I was in a meeting in DC, and it was something, it was talking about, you know, economic opportunity, and we had to create like a model for something, and there were these intermediary investors, and you had to pitch your thing, and then they would say whether they were going to invest in your project. So the reason I mentioned this is because we were looking at the project that we talked about in our group, which was the Communities of Opportunity program in Seattle, but so it was King County, Seattle Foundation, and some of the community people, was to buy existing rental properties in South King County and convert them to resident co-op ownership. And that model is because it's cheaper to buy a moderate rent apartment building than it is to buy a piece of property, because the cost of construction, it's almost half. We figured out it's almost half of the cost to buy an existing, not a high-end building, but a moderate building, which there's tons of them in South King County. Do a little bit of work and convert them into resident cooperative ownership, or it could be a land trust for that matter. So we need to have more ideas, different types, ways of doing it, but the idea of really transferring more of the housing asset to individual ownership, I think that in itself is equity.
Can I add that also one of the things that we forget is the impacted communities have to be at the center of the decision making, right? And while you are talking about all that, I'm just like reminded by Policy Link's tagline, equity is the superior growth model. What does that mean? If you focus on the people in the margins and you want to bring them up, everybody benefits. So people had just to reframe that for themselves and just thinking about it from that perspective.
I've got a second question. I'm going to skip one of my questions because I think we've actually gone over it pretty well. I was going to ask what the benefit of home ownership is in this time, but I think we've kind of talked about the benefits to buyers. How does the community as a whole benefit, though, from more people owning their own home? How do we as a community benefit when the greater percentage of our residents are owners?
Well, there's a lot of data that if you have stable housing, now frankly, if you have rent control, rental, might be just as good. I mean, you don't get a return on investment, but from the stability perspective, right? You know, people do better in school. They're more, you know, mindful of what happens in their community because they consider themselves to have a stake, to be a stakeholder as opposed to passing through, right? So I think ownership is much data supporting that. I think actually one of the challenges for us, particularly for the African American Black community, is the transfer of the assets. We actually have some older, quite a few actually, older African American households that own their homes, being clear, in the CD and on the South End, but they're not able to give their homes to their kids because they have to get a return on it and sell it, and the kids can't afford to buy it. So one of the things about inequity is that over time, certain groups that had the ability to own have transferred it within their own families. And so with every generation, you have, so this is the other thing about home ownership, how does it help the community, is that there's a transfer of assets and it appreciates, so that the second generation is better than the first generation and the third generation is better than the second generation. Renters don't get that. And the whole community benefits from that.
Yeah, I'll just say that it curbs displacement, and also, I mean, how many of you did the one night count? It's ridiculous how, 10,000 people were homeless mean, if everybody is housed, it's about moral authority and just, you know, making sure that I have a 6-year-old who's just very intuitive, and every time he just sees homeless people outside, he's like, do they sleep here? Even when it's cold? So it's the community, the whole community benefits when, you know, everybody is thriving. You know, your kids, the kids do well in school, you know, we wouldn't have to import folks from other countries to work for Microsoft and places that you feel like you invested in, right? Because the kids will be doing really well and things like that, so that's what comes to mind.
Well, as I said, with ownership comes responsibility. If you want to solve the youth crime problem immediately, give the youth a sense of ownership in their community. Because I don't know many youth that have graffiti on their homes, right? Because they feel they want their stuff to look nice, you know? And so, you know, with ownership, people feel like they have a stake, they have common interests to protect, to be stewards, to improve. You know, as a renter, in your mind, you may just feel you're transient. You know, this is not yours. You're going to be moving, and so I think the stability part, but also just the bonds that are created that actually make a community. A community is not just people in the same place. Like there has to be, you know, some shared interests and things of that nature. So I think ownership, it grounds, it connects, you know, and it bonds.
So, current events, and Uba, you were just mentioning this, have really placed homelessness at the forefront of our minds. And in light of that crisis, of so many people living on the streets, where does homeownership fit in addressing that type of crisis and in creating a place where everyone has a safe place to live?
So, for me, what comes to mind is with, you know, maybe the units that, for example, if we do this radical thing and invest a lot in land trust and things like that, is there a way, I'm not expert on how land trust work, but reserve some of the units for transitional housing, get wraparound case management for the folks who are homeless, work on if the issue is credit and things like that, and then just set them up for the next thing if it's home ownership or, you know, go through co-ops or things like that. So that's one thing that I could think about that home ownership can play a role on.
That's great, thank you.
I think we've lost sight of the continuum of housing in Seattle. And clearly majority of the people are not in a position to own their own homes. They should be, but they're not. So not everyone, that shouldn't be the priority. Priority should be, especially your public money, priority should go to the people that are hardest to help themselves. So there's no question about it. But at the same token, I think we've lost sight is that to help the people at the bottom, there has to be a motion, you know, a wheel. Yeah, you know, it's got a, used to call it continual housing, nobody even talks about it anymore. Home ownership is on the part of the continuum when people move on and be on their own. So it may not be where you put most of your resources, but you do need to have a way for that to happen. And even if it's cost more money, because the market requires you to do that, and the cost of production requires you to do that. We doubling the housing levy. We're actually cutting home ownership by 50%. And I frankly am okay with that, because the absolute amount of dollars is important. But I just don't think we spend enough time trying to figure out how to solve this problem. And we kind of just get rid of it by saying, oh, it's too expensive. Well, I just read a whole editorial how if you spend $15 billion, you could solve the homeless problem in Seattle, which is probably true. But if you spend $15 billion on anything in Seattle, you could probably solve that problem.
Good for Bertha.
So that's not to say that it's not important to do that. But it's to say we need to have perspective and understand that there are priorities and, you know, how you do it, but you can't just rob Peter to pay Paul.
The question was, when we have such a crisis of homelessness, how does homeownership fit in that as a priority?
Well, I mean, I think the Habitat for Humanity model show, you know, you have lands, you have people that need lands, or, you know, I think, you know, that's for a lot of people, I mean, that is the dream that we're sold. The white picket fence doesn't usually come with an apartment. So I think that it's important. And again, you think about who gets in, right? So first it's just homesteading. If you can go wherever you put your fence or whatever land you can handle, that's your land, okay? And then you close the gate on that, and then you have, you know, veterans, you know, coming back from World War II and they need homes, and so then FHA creates, you know, suburbs, and some people are in and some people are out again, you know, and then you have, you know, policy, I think, for a number of years where there was kind of an encouragement for people to, you know, there was a lot more access for people to have homes, even within the problem, with problems. And now it just seems in general, society-wide, by whoever is, you know, designing what the new society looks like, we're just gonna put people in these, you know, dorms and have them work, and, you know, and so whether it's a podment or a condo in South Lake Union, these are not communities at the end of it, you know, and then, you know, again, for the service workers, we'll just build dorms for them at the edge of the city or just outside and bust them in and have them out, you know, so we have to really think about what type of society, and community being a microcosm of this larger society, do we actually want? Because at this point, it seems that most of us are so busy working, trying to survive, that we don't have the luxury to sit back and design where things are gonna be in 10 years. It's just we show up in 10 years and realize, oh wow, I don't get to see my family that much. There's no such thing as Sunday dinner, you know, like there is no more community. So I think it's important to think about what, for us to grow as human beings, what are the environment that is most conducive to that? Not just what is most conducive to a developer making a profit or a corporation making a profit.
I have kind of a weird reasons on this question, because, you know, the majority, significant, not the majority, a big chunk of the THUD budget, the transportation, housing urban development budget that's allocated for HUD housing, comes from the premiums from FHA insurance. And so actually, the more people use FHA insurance, the more there is money to do low-income housing, subsidized housing. And I think if we got rid of I support getting rid of the mortgage interest deduction from a certain point on. I think there should be allow that for low-income families, but that could generate resources. And so I think from that side, in terms of homeownership, is actually good for providing resources to support the other. If right now the National Income Housing Trust Fund comes from the profits from the FHFA, which is the Freddie Chang government-sponsored GSE. So home ownership actually does generate revenues to support the rest of the continuum. And to the extent that people can buy homes, it generates revenues for that. So it's kind of a self-interest reason, but it's a reason nevertheless. And actually, because FHA has kind of priced themselves out of the market, they've lost $8 billion in the THUD budget last year because of the reduced FHA premiums. So it's a significant resource.
Let's go ahead and open it up for questions from the audience, and I think probably everybody can hear. So if we just want to stand up and speak loudly and who has a question for the panel as a whole or a member on the panel? Yeah.
Just, I want to know what role you all saw for Black and people of color-led organizations in creating equitable communities.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great question. It speaks to equity, because I think equity is also at all phases of the ecosystem. So not just, you know, in this community right now, we have issue. I mean, the HALA is all about, if you ask me, apartments. So you have a community that was homeowners becoming basically clients in apartments, and they're not participating necessarily in developing and building the apartments, owning, you know. And so I think Uber referenced it earlier that, you know, the most impacted community should be at the center of making decisions, of ownership, and otherwise you just create a perpetual cycle of kind of client service, private provider, dependent relationship ongoing. And so the goal should be to move not only individuals but communities to build capacity there, rather than to have organizations that may not be accountable or vested in the community that they're making decisions for or stewarding resources for, accountable to those communities. So I think that's a very good question and a very important thing, that we should have those communities in positions. The lens that we look through Africatown is about ownership and control or power or decision-making authority. And we look at that as, is this, you know, a benefit, or is this, you know, really empowering someone else in the name of helping, you know? So it's like, let me help myself to helping you. When we look at who's the executive staff, you know, and this is across the nonprofit, now people call it the nonprofit industrial complex, which is like parallel to the military industrial and the prison industrial complex. Who is able to actually have health benefits in this organization? Who is making decisions about how resources are allocated in this organization? Who is actually able to pay a mortgage, you know, versus whose faces are on, you know, the brochures, and whose story is told at the annual breakfast on the stage that gets everyone, you know, given. So that's a very important question. I think that is critical to the equity. So when the mayor says equitable development, we say, yes, we want to also participate in the development.
What do you say?
You know, I grew up in a colony, I was born in Hong Kong, grew up in a British colony, and I went to Catholic school from kindergarten to high school. I know what missionary is, and I know what colonialism is. And it's a white man's burden thing, it doesn't work. It relates to the aspiration thing that I was talking about. You have to put the people who need to, that opportunity to control their own destiny. And this is because otherwise that aspiration is never satisfied. And whether it's in the realm of hope or it's in the realm of realizing assets, if you're always being done for, you're never going to actually own the asset. So ownership is I think, black capitalism. Having a black-owned enterprise that's driven by profit is just as important as having a good social service agency that provides good services. You need both of them. But many times in our sector, we want the service agency. We don't understand the importance of black capitalism to the black community.
And I just want to add that it's like twofold. A lot of times, there's communities who are impacted have the solutions, right? But the problem is there's lack of access and planning and decision making. So we really need to decolonize that in order for these people to like come up with their solutions and be able to be the breadwinners and
seems to be development, so capitalism, as well as policy problems. So for example, developers are not choosing to develop in multi-family zoned housing areas, so therefore they're missing a great opportunity to build communities. And there's also local policy that's happening that is perpetuating systemic racism. For example, in 2010, Safer Union and Safe Union, the sting that happened at 23rd and Union, it ended up leading to, a open-air drug market was reduced, but what followed after the sting was Thompson's Point of View closed down, and all of a sudden, like, white-owned marijuana dispensaries happened to pop up, and developers moved on the corner, and it's just basically, it was a policy that was, it was a policing, systemic, like, racialized policing policy that ended up happening. So I guess my question is,
So are more drugs or lesbian drugs, or less drugs being sold in 2030?
I think it's the same clientele, but
I don't know, I don't think anybody's making $1.4 million a month.
the owners are different, they're not getting, hauled off to jail. But the thing is the concept of policies, it's not, that's not a question about like drugs versus voting units, it's just like, there's black dealers and now they're white dealers.
Do you have a question
I
for
do
the
have a question.
panelists?
So,
All right.
how, in your eyes, do you fight against development that seems to be kind of running rampant, choosing single-family zone housing areas? And also, how do you fight against like local policies that might prevent from reinvesting in local communities?
Thank you.
Sorry.
That's all right, that's all right.
I actually think Seattle's doing pretty good. Greg Nichols started the Race and Social Justice Initiative, I don't know how many years ago, 12, 15 years ago, and it was internal to the city. It was not, it was really trying to deal with structural racism inside the city. They were doing it within the city departments. It's morphed over time. I think the thing that Uba talked about, the comprehensive plan update that's happening in Seattle. The city is actually trying to look at equitable policies in community planning. And that's a good start for what you're talking about, which is to make sure that the planning, the impact of planning decisions are equitable to communities. And for the first time, the people part of planning is becoming more addressed. Whereas before it was only built environment, land use and zoning, and environmental. That's actually one of the things that the Regional Equity Network 10 years ago, working with the PSRC on the regional strategies, trying to say, look, when we do planning and we do environmental impact studies and we do all these things, what is the people factor? So one of the things that have come out is around displacement, around economic opportunity. So I think there's some good stuff happening in the city. And you can't stop finance capital unless you have a revolution and take it over. And take over the means of production, okay? That is the only way. As long as we're working within this system, you have to, you're trying to mitigate it, but I think you have to try as hard to compete with it as to fight it. And this is where asset building for oppressed communities is so important. We talk about homeownership. There should be shareholders. There should be affirmative action for owning shares of stock. Just like for NRA, I'm all for the Second Amendment, but every single person should own a gun. All the people of color should be given a gun. And if somebody pushed for that, guess what? There would be some people that would be for gun control. This is the thing about raising when you don't, it's better for the whole society.
And from the community piece, I'd actually organizing, coalition building, building power, so to change those systems. And also, actually multiracial, multi-ethnic coalitions, not just working in silos, but like, for example, if as a multi-racial group. We're all working on the Black Lives Matter movement, and that, I think everybody benefits, right? So I think that organizing and movement building and that evolution you talked about, when we organize, is one way that we can change systems.
One final question from the audience? Yes.
So, just very quickly, three points. I think that education is important, and that many times we talk about systematic oppression, not in a realistic term, in terms of African Americans just being systematically freed. We could talk about criminal justice reform, but literally systematically freed only 50 years ago. So when we talk about like opportunities to asset building and wealth, this is a very new generated concept in our country. I think the second thing is about fairness. Anybody who's an attorney knows that they will beat fairness out of you in law school. There's no such thing as fairness as what is legal. And I think that there needs to be a radicalization in the way in which we address policies. And the third thing I want to ask the panel is, we talked a lot about this, but I think, how do we infuse economic development, asset wealth building in a proactive way? I know we talked about kind of this, the Shark Tank, but what are some ways? San Francisco is many times the model in which we looked upon for homeless policy, but I also want to bring up the latest article about their one-night count is that 7% of the people who are homeless in San Francisco were at one time owned homes. So how do we actually address proactively a detriment of the people who are being displaced into apartments and to rental as the rents increase? They're then might be displaced into a much more critical status of stability. So how are we going to proactively address that?
Did anybody see the movie The Big Short? Pretty rough stuff. I think education is key. That speaks to the revolution piece. I mean, people are just, enjoying the Seahawks game and going on, and the next thing you know, wham, you just get wiped out, but you didn't know what was coming, or maybe you weren't informed to really kind of express your will into the world, into the environment. I think that people are so distracted, whether it's being surviving or then coping with the stresses of surviving, that we're not really planning and shaping the world that we want to live in. So I think education, as you said, and informing people, because a lot of people don't, and in certain communities, if you're not third generation, if you're not trained to be an economic predator, it's just, you're a victim. And so I'm not saying that people need to be trained to be economic predators, but we need to be clear about the environment that we're operating in and the forces that are at play, and how can we, best safeguard ourselves, or make the world better for us. And that, I think that applies to a lot of issues. You got environmental justice issues that are wrapped right into that. So where are people being displaced to? They're being displaced to places where there's lead, there's garbage dump, there's traffic, so all of these things are wrapped in. So there needs to be a lot more education about, where, when you look at climate change, who's affected, first, most by those things. I hope that answers in some ways. I think education is important. And then those that are, Uba hinted at this, it's like talking about the problem is not solving the problem. So sometimes people will come to or listening to people talk about the problem is not solving the problem. So you'll come and you're not, it's like going to church, and so then people go back and say, oh, that's so bad, but hey, people make the world go round. And I'm this is where my optimism comes from, is that I believe that they're just people too. you know, and so they're more organized and more, I guess, I don't know, diabolical. I don't know. They get up every day and figure out how are we gonna do this, you know, and do things. And I think we need to get up every day and figure out how are we gonna do this and do things. Yeah, I think that's really important. We must be picky in the brain also.
Diabolical is our new core value. It's
No,
diabolical.
we're gonna be vigilant, persistent.
I feel like talking about home ownership, affordable housing, without talking about jobs, and, you talked about, people were owners before they became homelessness, what caused that? Maybe majority probably did not have jobs or lost their jobs, and just making sure that, there's jobs in place, getting a shared analysis of, the oppression that we keep talking about and how we can, practically start to undo that. How can we organize as a community? And also the fact that, we know housing is the most expenses that everybody has. What is next? Childcare, transportation, we add all that up for especially communities of color who are disproportionately affected. It just kind of, makes the burden even higher. So, and then as displacement happens, folks are being displaced in South King County. They are forced to own cars. That also adds to transportation costs. So just getting a whole education around that. And I'm gonna actually, again, just talk about, for example, Rainier Beach, right? When we talk about affordable housing and maybe zoning for affordable, HALA has this the next zoning that's gonna happen is gonna be specifically for housing and affordable housing. But Rainier Beach has another need too, right? The unemployment rate there is 3 times higher than the rest of the city. So listening to what that community needs, what kind of zonings do they need to have their economic development met? We need to talk about things like that and just kind of find out what the issues that community is facing instead of just getting a blanket policy or resolution that it fits all.
I just wanted to add too, I mean, that's, the work with Hack the CD is about connecting our community to the broader startup ecosystem, and we just opened a co-working space and incubator on 23rd and Union in the eye of the storm, I guess you could say. And so I think that's equally important too, access. I mean, we're being displaced by, economies that we're not participating in. So economic development is actually critical. I mean, you look at the work that's happening on 23rd and Union, and these are all jobs that might have allowed you to live in this community. I don't even know if that will at this point, but you don't see people from the community working on these jobs, So when we look at these infrastructure projects, I think the local hires or priority hires is striving to work in that direction, but it's just all these layers of you're excluded here, and then there's a ripple effect of where else that excludes you. So, yeah.
And things like community benefit agreements, right? With the comp plan now that we're talking about, we just found out that you can have community benefits agreement in the land use code, but you can have talk to developers like the 23rd and Union and have some kind of community benefits agreements there that meets the community needs. So it's, again, just goes back to, it will be more effective if we can put it in the land use code, but we can start by working with what we have.
Big Tony has the answer. He said pitchforks and torches, right?
I mean, if you want to fundamentally change, ain't gonna happen with, I agree with Malcolm X on that one, ain't gonna happen in the ballot box, okay? But you live with what we live with, and you have to, I think part of the problem with the financial crisis, the big short, is the people were not at the table. And, now, fortunately, they've regulated a lot of that, so they've got rid of a lot of that stuff, but.
Thank you all so much. I'd love to have you just recognize our wonderful panelists with a round of applause. Thank you to all of you as a final, I think we'll hang around for a little bit more, and there's plenty of food if you wanna have a one-on-one, question with any of our panelists, but there was a sheet of paper that I hope you got when you came in, which has some additional ideas for this, panel series. We'd love to get your feedback on the ideas that are there, or your suggestions for other topics that you'd like us to convene conversations on in the community. You wanna fill that out and leave it at the table before you go? Thank you so much.